Yeah, buddy. So we're back with Chris, Harry, and Hayden here. Last week we talked about Esther. Well, we actually didn't talk about it. We talked it. We talked it.
I talked it into existence.
Yeah, we voice acted it, which was super silly and fun. And so at the end of this episode, we'll have some outtakes from that if you were curious about hearing how bad we actually are.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's funny. So, so now we're going to do kind of the same thing we did with Ephesians, which is now that we've read it in its entirety, listened to it maybe a few times throughout the couple weeks that it's been since we recorded. Mm-hmm. What are we thinking? What's kind of... Yeah, what's standing out and what is the purpose of this book? Big questions here.
Well, let's start from a 30,000 foot view and then go through it chapter by chapter. Yeah. I think one of the obvious things that I recognized about this story, and this is something that you've said to me before, Hayden, is that it is just sort of very dramatic. It's high drama. Yeah. There's not a lot of downtime. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of crazy things that happen. There's a lot of ridiculous characters, like in a movie where there's like the super bad guy Haman and then like the purest of the pure girl Esther. Like it's just very much like a movie script that you're reading, which I think sets it apart from a lot of different books of the Bible that might be super slow and difficult to read.
It's really, it's like an interesting like short story as opposed to, well, not that the Bible isn't interesting, but there are a lot of parts of the Bible that don't feel as compelling.
Yeah, like numbers, like reading through that there were 13,054 whatever, and just like, wow, why am I reading this?
Actually, one of the reasons I love some of Old Testament books is because they read like a novel, and they just keep, like, First Samuel I love reading it. Yeah. Like, I really want to know what's going to happen next, and I feel like Esther's written that way too.
Yeah, you could just like take cover to cover Esther, put a hardback on it, and give it to someone, and be like, read this book, and they'd be like, whoa, this is cool. Yeah. Until like the last two chapters, and they'd be like,
why am I reading this? Oh, this was history? Oh, lame. Yeah. But I think this book of the Bible, like others, like First Samuel, like you said, or like a Jonah, like they read different. They read in an entertaining sort of way, as opposed to like prose. Yeah. Like Ecclesiastes or something like the Torah, which is very, very dry sometimes. So this was exciting to read and to act out.
And I mean, if you're like me too, this could really speak to you because I'm not a big guy for memorization, and I know memorization's good. Like Jesus modeled it, Paul modeled it. Like it's a good thing. But for me, what really sticks with me more is stories, and that's how I like think of God in moments that I need to think of Him. I was like, oh, God brought His people out of this situation. Like this applies to me during this time.
Man, I was thinking about that the other day and how cool the Bible is in the fact that it does like utilize all these different tools to get the same message across. And so if you are someone, who is just like loves stories, loves narrative, like there's places in the Bible that you're just gonna be like, oh, this is amazing. Or if you're like a mathematician and you love logic, like Paul might be the guy for you. You're gonna love reading his stuff because he's just so logical. Or you can turn to the Psalms if you're just like a creative, poetic, sort of person, and those are gonna speak to you. And like, I just think that's so cool that, like, there's no person, like, their wiring is not left out. Like, everyone is spoken to in the Bible. So that is just a cool thing.
And I think to emphasize that without going too far into it, but that shows you that God uses all kinds of people, too.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Which is really neat.
That is a really good point.
Yep, well, and then I wouldn't know this. I feel like this is, like, your Bible trivia. But, like, another thing that doesn't like come out to me when I read this, but like something that I already knew was that God is not explicitly mentioned in this book of the Bible. And so like I feel like that is what you're talking about with like different mediums or different ways of getting the story across or the message across. This in and of itself, in regards to that, does it in a very specific way in that it teaches you something about God without Him ever being an explicitly named character in the story, which I think is cool. And if I had to guess, was probably done on purpose. But just to your point, it's like a cool way of teaching something about a character that's never even in your story.
Yeah, I don't think I had heard that until just like a year or two ago. And I don't, honestly, I couldn't remember before then the last time I even read the book of Esther. Like, why would you, unless like you were going through it in church.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. It has to be intentional. And if you know the Jewish people, then you should know their heritage and that they follow the one true God, and that's their thing. But the book doesn't require you to necessarily know that. But if you do know that, then you know why they're going through this, their history with the Exodus, that God continues to bring them out. And so you're kind of bringing that into Esther, going, okay, I know about the Jewish people. I know that they have been brought out of things before. Like, let's see if that happens.
Yeah. So that's maybe a good place to start with this is, so the setting is kind of interesting and I think unique in the Bible. Maybe there's some prophets there are some prophets that kind of speak to this time period too, but not really many. So this takes place in Persia, which is, during the reign of Persia, which, is just like a real thing. Like, historically, we know that. If you've seen the movie 300, you know what the Persians are all about. It's like, this is a real place and time that actually happened. And so that's just interesting. But like, how did Israel get to be living in Persia? What was kind of the history that led to this? Someone want to give us a quick recap?
As I look to my right.
So if you know about Jewish history, they've spent a lot of time after the Exodus being divided and then being put back together and then divided again. And you have basically, to go through Israel's history, you have the Exodus from Egypt, and they have the conquest of Canaan. And then you have Judges govern Israel. Judges, terrible point in time, but gets redeemed through Samuel, and then through a little bit through Saul, not much, and then definitely through David. David's like their glory days,
because they're actually their own autonomous kingdom at that point. That's like the that's like the one sliver of Israel's history where they're not slaves, basically.
And if you continue reading through the Bible, knowing that, you'll see them constantly talking about like the good old days. Yeah. Like that's what they mean when
they refer back to the times of King David.
Yeah. So you have the United Kingdom, which is that time, which is like a great time. And then you have the divided kingdom. David makes mistakes. His sons rebel against each other, rebel against him. The kingdom gets divided. And then they go into exile. Then they have a time called Assyrian exile. And then you get into Babylonian captivity. So basically, the Jewish people have lost almost all their power. They're in captivity. They got taken over. And this is where this gets set.
So, like, the only book I know that has Babylon in it, this explicitly, is Daniel. Like, where would this line up? Would it be before, during, after? We don't know.
I think that this is coming after, because I think the Assyrians run through first, take over Israel, and then but Judea kind of stands alone for a little bit.
Yeah, the Assyrians are actually, not nice to them, but they allow them to keep their religion.
But then someone else comes in. Bigger, badder, Babylon.
Yeah, Babylon comes in, they take over, and that's when you see they ship out all the smartest, the greatest people, and that's the story of Daniel. And then I'm pretty sure now we're sitting in a third kingdom wave that has moved in, that being Persia, and they're now kings over this. And you see, I think this is where Ezra, Nehemiah come back into place, where Persia doesn't operate exactly the same as Assyria and Babylon. They allow people to kind of go back and rebuild the temple and things like that. So I could be wrong. Check me on that.
So what I see here, it's very close, and I think there is a little bit of confusion, but it looks like there's Jehoiakim as a vassal of Babylon is like a mark in here, and then right after Jehoiakim is Zedekiah, and then Judah under Babylon's rule, and then Jeremiah, and then Daniel, and then Ezekiel. So it comes like right before Zedekiah. Apparent. This is probably also educated guessing.
Right.
We don't get. So it's right before a lot of prophets. It seems to be what it is.
Yeah. Well, and I would say maybe this puts like the tip on our overview discussion, which is a lot of books in the Bible play off of this theme of being in exile or being a slave or being in like political asylum. And I think that this, once again, has like a different facet of all those things. This is Esther who is pulled from her heritage, from her land, into, basically a foreign land underneath a foreign king, that does not agree with the way that she lives her life or does her religion. Yeah. And it's like, how is she supposed to remain faithful to God? Like Daniel, there's definitely a book about that. A lot of once again, the books of the Old Testament are really, really hard on that particular. Like, how do you be a Jew underneath Pharaoh? How do you be an Israelite underneath Babylon? So.
Right. How do you live out your faith underneath another power?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And as you can see, like we even talked about, Assyria handled it differently than Babylonia. So like, there's different ways to do that depending on your.
Yeah, so I think that is something that sticks out to me as we read this. Is I think, and this is just, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone really say this, but I think that it's in conversation with other similar passages that Daniel, for sure, it's in conversation with it, saying, Daniel is how do we respond while we're living in exile? Do we rebel? Do we, just kind of slowly plot? Or do we, just go all in? Do we just invest in the culture wholeheartedly? What are the things that we do? And so we see Daniel's response, which is basically just go all in, but with a few certain guidelines of don't bow down to the idols. So don't worship their kings, or don't worship their gods. Don't worship their kings. But other than that, be for them.
Still give them respect, follow their orders up until it conflicts with your...
And like Esther does that in this story. Yeah. Joseph's another person who does that in his story.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And as you were talking about Daniel, I was like, Daniel lines really closely up with Joseph.
Yeah. Well, all three of these kind of line up too, because that's another thing I wanted to talk about, is that like in the Old Testament and then in like the whole Bible, you've got these protagonists that are very, very flawed, like obviously flawed. Like you've got Peter doing dumb stuff or betraying Jesus, or you've got, Cain and Abel. It's like, who are these protagonists that are these somewhat terrible people? But then those three that we just talked about are kind of like these shining white lights. Like they never really do anything truly bad in their stories.
You know what, too? Like I'm just like seeing this for the first time. All of those line up with Moses too. Mm-hmm. It's about God using one of his people through another kingdom to bring his people out and to save them. Yeah. Like that's how he does it every single time.
And he picks somebody very interesting. In this one, like we're in 2020, so this is not the way it is anymore, but like women, like he picks a foreign woman in this story to save an entire nation. Like that is a very, very powerful statement when this was written thousands of years ago. Absolutely. Moses, me and Romo were watching The Prince of Egypt this weekend.
Oh my God,
it's like, dang, this movie is amazing. But it's like, Moses, like this ironically, raised, royal subject basically, who has this past that he, only knows after a certain amount of time. Like, of course he's the perfect, the Saul that turns into Paul. It's like he picks these ridiculous protagonists that, like, of course, turn out to be, in hindsight, the perfect people to do what he wants them to do.
I think Esther brings this all together perfectly with, maybe you were made for such a time as this. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing. Like it's you were put there for that moment. And like you're talking about Moses as the perfect person, Daniel. Yeah. It's awesome.
The other thing I think that's just kind of worth noting is, okay, these are God's chosen people. Why are they living in slavery? Why are they living in exile? And part of this is important because it brings up some context as to why Haman is like such a bad guy. Mm-hmm. But I think it's good to remember that like God has allowed mistakes to have ramifications. Mm-hmm. And so this is one thing that I think is just worth saying a lot, because I think we tend to blame God for bad things when the Bible is saying actually it's, sin, but sin that humans have allowed to enter in. Because, you rewind it all the way back is like, well, God's good plan was to have humans in the garden with him. But who ruined that? Oh, not God.
It was us,
Yeah. And then, so it was God's good plan for Abraham and his family to live in the promised land. Oh, but who ruined that? Oh, that'd be Abraham's sons when they sent Joseph away. Right. But then God still raises him up. But the Egyptian slavery is a result of that. Like, they go to Egypt to be their provision in a time of famine rather than just trusting that God's going to provide. So you have that. And then you see the same things going on with Daniel, like, why are we in exile? Well, the kings were disobedient. They partied up with Assyria as opposed to, trusting God. And so I just think it's good to remember that God's not the one who is, like, punishing. He's just saying, I'm allowing your choices to have consequences.
Right.
I think that's really important because, like, we could talk about that particular subject for a long time. But just to say that, like, God's judgment, even when you're reading a whole book of the Bible, which, like, is what we're recommending because a lot of people don't do that, but you still need to look at that book and story of the Bible in concert with everything that's around it. And sometimes you need to start literally from page 1 and get all the way there to clearly see, like, oh, yeah, like, why are the Jews in exile right now? Or why are they slaves right now? Or why are they being conquered by fill in the blank of whatever, superpowers conquering them? It was for a reason, and it was actually because of something that they did, something we did.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, the huge plot conflict in Esther is that they're facing mass extinction by this guy, Haman. And so then the question is, well, like, why? And why is God allowing this? And part of it was Saul was actually supposed to have dealt with this problem before. It all over Esther, you hear this, and he is the son of Agag, son of Agag, son of Agag is Haman. Yeah, he's an Agagite, and you're like, okay, I get it. Why?
Is that important?
And then, later they, like, his wife says it explicitly, like, these are the enemies of your fathers. And so you're like, oh, wait, there's a backstory going on.
What's the prequel? What's Haman's origin story?
Yeah. So Saul's big mistake was that he didn't kill King Agag when he was supposed to. He let him live. And now you see the result of that is that Agag's son, later, like grandson by a long shot, is now this big bad guy, and they're having to deal with these ramifications. And then you're like, well, why would God want Saul to kill Agag? That seems kind of messed up. But then you got to remember again, going back, is they wouldn't have had to deal with these foreign people in their promised land if they just would have stayed there instead of going to Egypt, And so it's like, we're like, why does God say these things? Why does he ask them to do these things? It's like, well, they're actually dealing with their own consequences here. It's not God.
Yeah, and you see that all over the Bible. But it's important to remember, too, when you're reading Old Testament, like, God's primary purpose is to preserve his creation and his people. And so you see God with the Jewish people, and sometimes that means that there are other people that get conquered and killed by the Jewish people, but the whole point of that is to bring everybody back to God. Like, it's all in line that leads up to Jesus to say creation will be redeemed, but that can't happen if the Jewish people don't succeed.
Well, and it's also really hard to, like, look at all these things that happen and not blame God for the bad things that happened, and then sort of gloss over the good things that he does in light of those bad
absolutely.
things. I just think that us as Western readers, and then us as, like, first world country, it's just all great. It's really hard for us to look at that and not be like, oh, the injustice of it all. Yeah. But really, like, when you just start from page 1, you see the consequences play out, and you get to a story like this where we are, as believers in this story, if I'm going to insert myself into there, we're there for a reason, and that reason is tied back to us, and God still finds a way to redeem us and prevents us from getting, extinguished.
Yeah. And that goes back to the flood story, too. Like, God made a covenant with humanity saying, I could kill you, you deserve to die, you deserve to be wiped out, but in spite of everything you've done, I'm going to choose to preserve you.
Yeah. So then we look, with all that stuff in mind, we take a look at Esther, who, again, is living in this foreign occupation. And I think part of the question is, what should be our response? What is their response, and how does it build on the image of what they've been doing before in dealing with foreign oppression? So, like, with this case, we have Esther, who later on, she's like, hey, if this had just been about our slavery, I wouldn't have actually pressed the matter. And that, like, when you first read that, you think that maybe that's her, like, kind of cozying up to the king, be like, oh, I wouldn't have brought this to your attention if it was just about slavery. It
was just double slavery.
But this is something bigger than that. But I think she's actually being true and honest when she says that. Like, she would have just dealt with the consequences of being a people in slavery. and trusted God to deliver them from that, because we've seen that in Moses' case, he does. And so I think she actually trusts God to deliver them out of slavery. But then she's wrestling with this moment, well, this isn't about slavery anymore. This is about mass extinction. Yeah. So do I just trust God to deliver, or am I supposed to be stepping up in trust of God to do something about it?
And that kind of touches on something we talked about a week or two ago, in an ancillary way, and that is faith versus works. And I think previously we were talking about that in a way of like, okay, what's going to get you into heaven or whatever? I'm using air quotes for the people that are listening. What's going to get you into heaven? Is it going to be you just like trusting and having faith and believing in your heart? Or is it going to be you feeding the poor and clothing the homeless and all of that? Or is it not either one of those things? And here, you're right. Like Esther is obviously a very faithful woman. Like she acts in a way that shows faith, but then she also acts. She also does things. So she's not just like sitting at home praying that her entire family and entire group of people isn't exterminated. She actually does something about it. So
yeah, that's a good point. And I think there is something to be learned from this, like, because we don't hear God directly in this, like it shows us that Esther really acted on her own volition, maybe inspired by God, maybe inspired from the stories, maybe inspired from, trying to protect her people and everything she's read, but really it's because of her knowledge base and her upbringing and all these other factors, rather than just God saying, hey, go do this. Yeah. Which for us is way more relatable.
Yes, it is. And that's a problem I have with the Old Testament, where it's like, where's the booming voice of God in my life? And it's like, well, it wasn't in Esther's life, and she was in way more sticky predicament than you ever have been, Harry. So like, why don't you buckle up?
Yeah.
Follow the lead.
That's true. Yeah, she didn't get any visions or...
No.
Yeah. And so I think, where you start to see that is really in Esther 4, where it's towards the end, Mordecai's talking to Esther, and he's like, this is just so good. Mordecai says, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than the other Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish." So Mordecai trusts God either way, which is cool just to see. He's like, okay, whether it's you who actually does the delivering or not, God's going to deliver us. Right. That's what we know. That's what we've seen. And so I trust that. However, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? And so he's like, maybe you are the one who's supposed to step up. And then Esther's response is just so good. She says, "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or night or day. And I, my maidens, will also do the same. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." And so she is like, I think this is where the tension between Daniel and Esther comes into play, is because Daniel doesn't follow the law by not doing something. He's breaking the law by not bowing down to the gods. Yeah, by just kind of abstaining from something. Here, Esther's going to be breaking the law by doing something. And so I think we see this kind of nuance. When should we just not do something, and just trust that God will deliver? And they say almost the exact same thing to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, where they're like, if you throw us into the fire, that's fine. God will deliver us. Even if he doesn't deliver us, we still trust that God is good. And if we die, we die. And so she says basically the same thing. And so you just have that little twist. But they go to God first. They're like, we're going to pray, we're going to fast, we're going to spend time. And one thing that, as I was listening to this most recently, I was always like, why does she do the 2 banquets thing? Why does she do the banquet the first day and then do it the second day?
Second time.
I think it's actually because she wanted to allow all 3 days of praying and fasting before she asked.
3 days,
which is interesting. And so she's like, really, like, I need to spend the actual time in prayer and communion and allow for God to show his hand. If he's going to open these doors for me, then I'll take the steps forward, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. So I guess, like, you brought up an interesting question earlier, and I just want to think through it. But, like, where I don't think we're ever going to find that like line in the sand. But yeah, for Daniel, it was not bowing down to a king.
It was inaction.
Yeah, and for Esther, it was the extinction of her people.
Yeah.
Like, but outside of that, like, where do we draw the line? Do we draw the line, like, in what our government controls? So I think that's a big question right now.
It is a big question right now.
Yeah,
I mean, it
very
seems,
practical.
Looking at Esther, it seems all the way up to slavery,
Yes.
right? Unless my people are going to die.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that's just a situational line, although I know what you're saying. But that is the question. Like, how do I apply this to my life? Like, that's, I think, a healthy way to apply the Bible. How do I stay true to God? How do I live a way that shows to everyone around me that I believe that God is king over all, and then still operate in capitalist 2020 America?
Yeah.
You know?
I think what is important to both of these two is that neither of them are like insurgents and like open rebellion, like trying to take down the king.
Yeah.
Well, I think both of them, if we're going to talk about Daniel and Esther, both of them were actually like in the cushiest position that they possibly could be in. You know, like considering, you know.
Well, bring in the other people we talked about too.
Yeah.
Like Moses and Joseph, both of them are just living large.
Yeah. Like they're in really, really good situations,
Yeah.
technically. And then they do, Esther, I'm really glad we talked about that in Esther 4, because it is like the end of Act 1. It's like the defying gravity of Esther. Like, it's so intense that those, like, the interplay of lines, because she's like, okay, I just got picked out of thousands of women. I'm the queen of everything. I'm basically, as top of the women that I could possibly be.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do something that, like, there's a really good chance I might die if I do it. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing that you guys brought up is in all those stories, they're risking losing that position. They're risking losing that authority and power.
Everything, yeah.
But trusting God instead. So, Daniel comes to this point where he's like, if I don't bow down or if I continue to pray and, trust God, I will lose this stuff. So who do I trust? Should I trust my authority, my position, or should I trust God? Esther in the same here. If I trust God and go before the king, there's a good chance I'll lose my life, and that's like losing that power and authority. And so I think that's a good thing to remember is that, yeah, the authority, the power that they've been given, the position that they've been given has been given to them, but they need to also not just cozy up in that and not just feel secure in that. Like, God is calling them or they're being called up to a point to decide what they're going to choose. Are they going to choose the comfortability of the life that they've been given, or are they going to be willing to give that up? In some cases, they're giving it back. In Daniel and Esther's case, like, they're actually given more because of the trust that they have in God and their willingness to give up that position. God responds by giving them back. Moses leaves Egypt, like, doesn't come back.
He's an exile, period,
Yeah,
afterwards.
he becomes a wanderer in the desert.
Well, I think and this can be an application as well. I think those characters seem to have a healthy appreciation for the earthliness of those things that they have, the power or the wealth or the comfort. And you can look at it two different ways. I think if you're Esther, you can look at it as like, yeah, I really like these things around me. I really like the situation I'm in, but like that was given to me by Babylon. Like the things that are given to me by God are things that cannot be taken away. And so having like a healthy opinion of this is not truly important to me. What's truly important to me is God.
Yeah. I think too it would be I don't know. I think it would be a bad move for us to not acknowledge that, like, every one of these situations, except, well, I would even say worshiping somebody besides God is equal to this, but it's life or death. Yeah, like Israelites have been in captivity and slavery before, and like every time God's redeemed them, it usually isn't surrounded like with a war. There have been times where they're following God and they go into war. But they're usually, when they're in captivity or slavery, it's like giving their captives the option. It's saying, look, like, we need to worship our God, we need to do this. Like Moses' case, like, let my people go.
Right.
Great phrase. Like, Pharaoh had opportunities. And if you look at, we can't get into Exodus, but if you look at that story, God gave Pharaoh a lot of opportunities. And if you look at this story, Esther is giving the king a lot of opportunities, and he takes it. Like, this is, like, good for the king here. Like, he actually listens to Esther.
That's true. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, kind of a flip side coin. We're comparing Esther and, Moses and Daniel, but maybe part of the comparison that we should be looking at here is actually the responses of the kings, too, and the result of that. In Daniel, like, King Nebuchadnezzar is brought low. He's brought to this, like, animalistic form, and God kind of puts him in his place. Same thing with Pharaoh. Yeah. They both responded by not listening to God. The opposite's true here, like, where King Ahasuerus listens, trusts what the advocate is saying, like, his kingdom actually prospers for some time after that.
I feel like maybe it was just the jolly way in which you voiced the king, but I thought the king was actually an okay guy when I listened to it, because it's like, open up first chapter, this dude's throwing a bash, dude. Like, the whole first chapter where they describe the party, it's like, I want to be at that party. It's like, no one was required to drink, but everyone, like, poor men and rich men alike, where it's like, this party's awesome. Yeah. So, like, he seems like, a pretty nice guy. And then he's, like, pretty conciliatory with Esther throughout the entire thing. Like, what do you want? Like, I'll give you half my kingdom, babe. You can have half of it. I'll give whatever you want. Like, he seems like, he's seemingly like a nice guy. That is probably not true when, like, you actually look at the Persian Empire.
Sure.
But in this story, he's certainly not like a pharaoh where you're like, why is this guy thinking the way he is?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not like the Pharaoh in the story of Moses. But yeah, it is interesting to see how these kings respond, and when they respond well, God blesses them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like this is probably hard for Christians to swallow, but that's outside of them even following God. Mm-hmm. Like, they might be following the advice of one of God's servants, but like in Joseph's story, like, that Pharaoh didn't convert to Judaism.
No, he was just like, thanks for the interpretation.
But he was blessed.
Yeah.
Like, that can happen. God can bless people through us, even if they don't follow our God.
Yeah, I think that's actually, like, a really practical moment here, and, like, gets to Paul where he's like, submit to the rulers and the authorities and the governing figures. And I think that's because that part of their theology is that, like, God has called rulers to like, have authority and dominion, but they're always supposed to be submitting that authority to God. And so whether they prosper or not is dependent on their humble state before God or not. And so I think that actually gives us a place to step in to say, okay, in all of these situations, what is the common denominator? Moses points to God as the ultimate authority over Pharaoh. And then you have, Esther does the same thing, but just kind of through her actions, and you see that consistent theme. And then Jesus, and like, ultimately, and I think, we'd be remiss if we didn't say that all these are pointing ultimately to Jesus and where he shows this the most. He does the same thing, and Pilate's like, don't you know that I have the authority to let you live or die? And Jesus is like, you have no authority but what's been given to you. So I think that is the place where we can step in and say, okay, regardless of some of the differences in the context, like, what's the consistency and what can we learn from that? Is that part of our role as Christians is to ask the authorities of the world to acknowledge where their authority and power comes from, and let them know that if you humble yourself before God, like, there will be, like, prosperity, whether that's, like, physical prosperity or not, just like that God will do good things in eternity if you submit your authority to him. If you don't, there will be judgment.
That's such a hard thing to do diplomatically. What you just said, like, because in each of those, that is what that protagonist does. And I don't even know if Esther I actually don't think Esther makes it that clear. She's not quite like, God is above you,
right,
and so this is his will. She does it in, like, a much more diplomatic way, but that is, in essence, what she's doing. So it's interesting to think about me in 2020. How do I diplomatically and calmly communicate to any sort of higher power to be like, hey, appreciate that you're leading, appreciate the work that you're doing, it's not easy, but I just want you to know that I know that every bit of authority that you have is not actually yours. It was given to you by higher authority.
This is interesting for me, because I don't know that I've ever thought about it this way, but it seems like it's almost moment by moment or situational. Like in a moment, a Pharaoh can be giving his allegiance to God. Now that doesn't mean he's following God.
He might not even know it.
Right, he might not even know it, but that doesn't mean that good can't come out of that.
Yeah.
So like to put it in like real world our terms, like whoever the president is, like you may hate them, you may not like them, but that doesn't mean in a moment God can't use them.
Well,
so like there can and probably will be good coming out of them whether or not you like them.
And I always pull from the Chronicles of Narnia, where C.S. Lewis kind of juxtaposes that with there's an evil group of people that follow Tash, which is like a fake idol god, and then there's the good group of people that follows Aslan, which is supposed to be like personification of God or Jesus or whatever in that book. And he says, like, even if you did things in the name of Tash, your god, but they were my things, they were my good things, it's like you were still actually doing them in my name. You didn't even know it.
Yeah.
So once again, it's like we're talking about the authorities, we're talking about the powers that be. We might also just be talking about people who don't necessarily explicitly follow God or any religion that's anywhere near us. It's like we can still have an influence on them that is not super evangelistic, but we can say things to them, we can have an influence on them, which points them to do God's will.
Yeah, points them to the ultimate authority.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the consistency in all of this. Like, what should we do? In all cases, we should be pointing people to the ultimate authority. Yeah. And I think, like, that sounds kind of like abstract, but I think it really gets like so practical to the day-to-day. It's like, what should I do in response to this conflict? Oh, I should point them to Jesus. Like, if that just becomes so practical once you put it in any situation.
Right. Well, and I think I've said this before too, like the most practical thing that I've ever seen that's going to help with that particular thing is like a WWJD bracelet, It's like, is it really that hard to point people towards Jesus? It's like, no. It's like whatever situation is going on right now, you should just be like, well, what do you think Jesus would do? Yeah. And you can say that in like a little bit, once again, less evangelical way if it makes you or them more comfortable. But it's really not that hard to put it in that context. And I think that is, even thousands of years prior, that's what these people are doing. Like Esther is thinking to herself, like, what is the most godly way for me to go through this? And like, after praying and fasting about it, she's like, I need to act. I need to do something.
I think you bring up an interesting point. Like, even talking to people who aren't Christians, if you frame it in the way of what is the loving thing to do, what is the right thing to do, like we might have different morals and different foundations, but a lot of the times I've had those conversations, we end up at the same place.
I think, and we could talk about this forever, I believe that there is a conscience in humans. And I think it's probably developed and it's probably different a little bit among people, but I think that there is an inert understanding of right and wrong. It's like, I'm a caveman. I don't necessarily want to push that caveman off the cliff because I don't want to be pushed off of a cliff. Like they might still do it because they want their belongings or something, but I just think that there is that inert, I know good and bad when it comes to certain things. And you're saying that I could talk to anybody and I could play off of that knowledge of good and evil, I could say, inside of them, regardless of who they are or what they believe.
Yeah. I think, obviously there's always exceptions to the rule, but I think by and large, And you could have people with way different perspectives on why that is. Like some people would say that's just how humanity flourished. We all had to put our needs aside for the good of the community in order for humanity to overcome like other animals, whatever you want to say.
It's just a social tool. Or
right.
Whatever,
Or you could say that was put there by God. But I think either way, like when you sit down in a group of people, like most of you will come to same basic ideas. Now when that gets super practical, and it gets political, then things get like crazy.
But I think what you're saying is, in any of those situations, if you try to appeal to that moral or whatever compass within people, like that loving goodness that we are going to choose to believe is in all people, period, then I think you're actually saying, what would Jesus do? You're actually pointing them towards God without maybe being super explicit about it and doing it in a way that's going to appeal to them.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis argues it really, really well in Mere Christianity.
I don't believe it. That guy's not articulate.
No, yeah, really well argued.
Articulate.
But yeah, he basically, that's the foundation of his argument for God, is that we have a moral compass, and if there is a standard of right and wrong, and some things measure closer to that, then there is a authority behind that, like there inevitably has to be. And so you're pointing people to God when you say like, well, okay, well, where is this authority coming from? And I think though part of the Israel responsibility that then gets passed into like the Christian responsibility is to say who that authority is. Like I think there is part of like that is the good news, is that like Israel's supposed to be saying, your gods aren't the gods, our God is, and here's the proof. They do it very poorly for like the whole thing, and they're supposed to be inviting people in because of that, saying like, look, your gods can't do what our God did in Exodus, so come be a part of this family of the true God. And I think that's part of the responsibility that we have too, is like, your gods can't raise people from the dead. Like no matter what you look to, whatever you think is the ultimate power and authority in the world, it will die. Our God doesn't, and he proves it. And so come, like, follow this God, follow Jesus. So yeah, I think that's there. But what you guys are saying is good, because like it's a universal starting place, and that's like I was gonna say, if you find yourself kind of arguing the existence of God or whatever, go to Mere Christianity, because C.S. Lewis does such a good job.
Well, and I think the two different points we're talking about, it's just like a progression. So it doesn't matter who you are or necessarily what you believe. Like, we're asking you to believe that there is good in everybody that you can connect to on some sort of a superhuman level, Like, you guys are just going to agree on certain things regardless of who you are. But then you're bringing it to the next, even for me, which is like the more uncomfortable spot, which is like, and then you need to explicitly say, it's the God of Israel that is determining these things between us. And like, I don't even know if I'm at a point in my life where like I can wear a shirt that says God Jesus on it, and that's about as evangelical as I get.
Well, I think too, like looking at these people for examples, like I don't know that it always has to be. If somebody asks you, that's how you respond.
But people will ask you,
and they will,
yeah.
And especially if you're living that way. And I think if you have the opportunity to talk about it, you should. But it's not always like being overbearing with it, like if you're loving people well and directing those people towards love well, and like really honestly trying to live that way, eventually like somebody's gonna ask you, like, even might be something basic, like, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Like, there you go, man, you got your opportunity, you got to talk about it,
just say it.
And a lot of times, like, just starting there is going to get you to those conversations. But I think bringing it back to like being a Christian and living honestly in a society that we like to call a Christian but really isn't that Christian, is that you have to maintain those values despite everything else. And not always in a way that's like rebellious, but in a way that you want the place you're living in to succeed, and the way it's gonna succeed is by being pointed back to who Jesus is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think like it does get really practical when you're talking about like what is the good news of Jesus, because I think sometimes it's like, oh well, I trust in Jesus to go to heaven when I die, and you're like, that's good news for sure, and it's true. But like if there's like such a bigger good news, which is that like there is a good Father who lays down his life that will like prosper you beyond this life into eternity if you humble yourself before him and like obey. And so I like that is like such good news, because everyone is looking for prosperity, everyone is looking for the good life, but anywhere else you turn is an 80 to 104 years maximum, prosperity. And so like to say that like, why do I follow Jesus? Well, because like I have seen that he is alone has the authority over evil and sin and death. And those are the things that take away all the other things. Like If you have a good family, sin, and that's where you put your faith, sin could ruin that. Like if you have just like a good life in general, evil from another source can come in and ruin that. If you're living a long life, death will come in and ruin that. So like no matter what you put your faith in, like one of those three powers is going to come in and ruin it. And so then the question is like, well, how is there hope then? And like the very practical hope is like, because Jesus proved that sin doesn't overpower him. He lived a life without sin. He proved that evil can't overpower him. Like he was handed over by the ultimate evil of both religious authority and governing authority, and yet death, he proved like can't overcome him. He rose from the dead and extends that life to people who follow him. And so I think it just like when you start to put all this into perspective, and like what the breadth and the width and the height and the depth of the love of God really is, like it becomes practical good news. And like that's what Esther is demonstrating here, is that okay, I'm putting the direct action, like I'm showing the king that he has an opportunity to use his authority to prosper the people of God, like I ask him, or not. Whether he does that, it doesn't really matter. What he chooses, God, like Mordecai says, like God will deliver, he will provide. But I'm giving him the opportunity to trust God in this moment. But whatever happens, my hope is found somewhere else.
Yeah. And like what she's doing is trusting in God. I think that's really good. I really like everything you said. I think to backtrack just a bit, a challenging point for Christians, I think really for me, is not to focus so much on, this sounds really bad, but the afterlife. Like a lot of people think the good news is solely that after you die, you go to heaven, when you don't. The good news is actually that relationship starts now. Yeah. Like you don't have to wait till you die. You shouldn't wait till you die to like live in that relationship with God. And like, that's the real good news. Like it starts now. And a lot of Christians now, like to live with allegiance to those other things you're talking about, family, occupation, whatever, all those things that will disappoint them, and then give like 10% over here to God, saying that when I die, like that'll be my life, but right now I'm not really going to focus on that.
Yeah. We can keep going down this track. So I think the one track that we see Esther really respond to is, how do we react when we are just under authority? How do we react to that authority? And I think kind of the conclusion we've come to is point them to Jesus all the time and say, and kind of give Jesus' response is, your authority comes from God, so do with it what you will, but know that there are consequences and judgment, which also is like a response to us too. Like we're not only supposed to just be pointing that to the authorities and the powers of the world, but reminding us, that that's the truth for us. And that's where you see that fruit, the truth come out in these stories, is they believe it because they lay their life on the line. They put their life on the line. In some cases, God delivers them. And in Jesus' case, like he does die because of his allegiance and obedience to Christ or to God. But obviously then God does, just like Mordecai say, he delivers him by other means, by his death and resurrection. So that's the one thing. I think the other thing would be the coolness that God isn't explicitly stated in this. And so you get this opportunity to see God's providence working in the ways that we kind of see it in real life, where it's like you kind of do the look back thing and you're like, oh, Mordecai just so happened to be at this gate where this plan was being made. And then you get the little juicy nugget forward, which is like, and then all this was written down in the presence of the king. And so you're like, okay, that's weird. But then later you go on and be like, oh, that actually was God's providence as well, because at some point the king notices Mordecai and is like, oh yeah, Mordecai, the dude that saved my life. I remember that from when they read that to me in the records. Okay. What do we do for that? And he just happens to not be able to sleep the night before Mordecai is going to die, and that's what saves him, and so you look back and you're like, oh, God consistently provides in these small detail ways. And so I think maybe that's the other thing that Esther can speak into, is not only how to respond in practical faith to God, but also where is God in this, and remembering that they're in exile.
Yeah. Well, and I think that second one that you said is the one that I personally can get really practical with, because it's kind of hard to read.
The first one's tough for me.
Well, and it's kind of hard to read like Genesis and be like, okay, let me apply this to my life, because it's it's so fantastic and foreign and just different. This is like a Netflix drama, as I've said, which is like still very different, but it is also much more applicable and practical, because God is not this like supernatural being that is mentioned and doing all these magical things. He's not even mentioned at all. But I could do exactly what you said in my own life. I can look back and I could say, okay, if I hadn't done that terrible thing and done that terrible thing and done that terrible thing and had Roma, my daughter, then I wouldn't be living like this great life that I am now. So like you can get practical and kind of in hindsight trace God through your life.
Using those things
for
his good.
Yes. And so like I think that's kind of what this story teaches us as well. You get to the end of it and you're like, oh my gosh, wow. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, these things all had to happen for us to reach this point, and then you can do that in your own life as well.
Yeah. I really like that, and I think that's where I can be practical as well too. I don't have a problem with the first one pointing people to Jesus, but I have a problem with what that actually looks like, because like to bring it really practical, and we don't have to take a side on it at all, but you have right now a church completely divided on an issue, whether it's godly to meet in person or whether it's godly to put the health of people first.
Yeah.
And like when you say like do what Jesus did, like you'll have one group saying, well, Jesus flipped over tables because people weren't respecting God's place of worship. That'd probably be like, okay, like we should meet in person no matter what, because that's what God instituted. And then you have other people being like, well, Jesus always put the needs of those that were struggling first.
Yeah.
And like he always put other people first, so like that's what we should be doing.
Jeez.
Like that, so that like, oh my gosh, like to be really practical with you guys, like that's what I'm struggling with, but that's what the whole church in that's what the church mainly in the US is struggling with.
Yeah.
Church worldwide is not struggling. Right. And I think that's probably what happened in the US is that it became a political thing. And so it wasn't about necessarily the issue anymore, it was more politics.
Yeah.
And like the church doesn't really speak into politics too much, except for respect the authority that's in front of you up until it gets in the way of up until it puts itself in place of God.
Well, and I'll say, maybe to put a bow on that as well, circling back to what Esther does, what does Esther do when she's presented with an issue? Like hers is obviously a little bit more black and white. It's like, do I do nothing and die and let everybody I know and love die? Or do I do something and maybe I die, but maybe I don't? You know, but when she's presented with an issue like that, she doesn't just like ask her best friend what they think and then say that. She doesn't just make an immediate decision. She's like, okay, I'm going to fast and I'm going to think about this for like 3 days.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to decide. I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to think really hard about it. And then I'm going to decide what I think the greatest thing to do is.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think, in some case, I think, part of what we should learn is that Daniel acts differently than Esther and Esther acts differently than Moses, but they're all doing the godly thing in their context. And so I think that is important. It's like, should we meet in person? Should we not meet in person? There might be one church across the road from another church that it is right for them to meet in person because they have people with, that depression that would be in a really bad way if they didn't meet in person. But the across the road might be a whole bunch of 80-year-olds who shouldn't be meeting in person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think part of that is, is Esther imposing against Moses and saying, you did it wrong by going and saying, let my people go. That's not what she says here. She doesn't say, let my people go. That could have been a totally reasonable response. But she says, if it was slavery, then it'd be slavery. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I agree with you, but I also disagree with you.
Yeah.
Well,
And like to push on it a bit, like these are completely different time periods, even from each other. Like, I don't know how far apart, but at least hundreds of years apart. But I just, because if it is a church across the street, then one church is obeying authority and one church is not obeying authority.
Okay, that is true, and that was one thing that I was going to say.
Unless it's not that situation.
Right, exactly, is, if the situation for both is you don't meet in person because that's what the law said, then it seems to hear that I think the response would be then you don't meet in person. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean,
you could talk across state lines though. Yeah. There could be one church in California that hasn't met in a year, and there could be another church in Texas that's been meeting regardless because that's what they're allowed to do in their situation, and that's where they feel God is leading them.
Yeah, well, also, I think we're juxtaposing an issue like the one Esther's going through where it's like, okay, this is black and white.
Yeah.
Like millions of people dying or millions of people not dying. And like now we're talking about an issue where like, Hayden, as you said, it could be situational where one church chooses A and one church chooses B. But I think that what that highlights is the answer is actually A and B at the same time, because it's situational, because there's groups of people. But the way that groups of people make decisions is not situational, and it's not, okay, how do we cater to everyone? It is pick an answer, and then we'll count up the A's and we'll count up the B's, and whoever had more is going to be the winner. Which I think is just like, if we're talking about how we, apply being God's hands and feet in these situations, I think it's bringing light to that, and that is going to strip the politics out of it. It's like, okay, maybe right and wrong isn't best answered with like a democratic vote, in these situations. Yeah. Maybe it's like, let's just look at the situation and think about what is the best way.
Yeah, maybe we need to spend some more time in sackcloth and ashes, fasting, before we make our decisions.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think we do a lot of time.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, and I think this really underscores and highlights how divided our church is more than anything. Like when I hear us talking about this, I'm like, there were definitely divisions before like Christ, but holy crap, we're divided.
Yeah.
Like when you look at the American church, there's unity in denomination, and that's like pretty much it, which is bad and it's sad.
Well, and there's unity in denomination, and then there's an incredibly low level of knowledge about what the denomination that you are unified within actually means.
Yeah. And I'd say actually there's way more unity in politics than there is in church.
Yes.
Which is frustrating.
Yes.
Like the church should be above all of that. Like it should be the bride of Christ, and that should be what identifies us first.
Yeah. So I mean, once again, I think now we're actually arguing for our point instead of against it, which is like, let's go back to point number one. It's going to be super difficult to do, and it's going to be super uncomfortable to do, and also you might need to like pray and fast about it for a couple days before you might not even then know what is super clear to do.
Yeah.
But you should try to really steer yourself into a mindset of, okay, what is my number one, above all, primary focus? Is it my political party? Is it the church? Is it the denomination? Is it my friends, my family? Because like all those things are really good things for you to like.
Is it my pastor?
Yeah.
Like
those are things that are really good for you to
can't be devoted to your pastor.
No, you have to be devoted to God. You have to be, and you have to understand what exactly that means.
Yeah, one thing that brings up, we should probably start wrapping up, but that brings up with this that I think is also really practical is, we talk about kind of pointing to Jesus, to the authorities, but I think we should just remember that means like all authorities, and one really practical way is like right now the American church is kind of reeling from a really high profile pastor who is now being exposed for bad things, sin in his life. And one thing that it just showed me is that like probably there wasn't enough pointing to Jesus to that guy who was a pastor, then because they just assumed he was fine. They just assumed he's a pastor, he's fine. And so I think, we can be like, the president, we need to be pointing him to Jesus. Or you might be on the other side where you're like, the president is for Jesus. But like, whichever way that you land there, you should still be pointing them to Jesus, because whether they look like it to you or not doesn't really matter.
No.
That's not what God calls us to, is to determine who looks like Christ and then point the other people to Jesus. You know, I think that's one of the things I love about the parable, the weeds and the wheat. It's like, that's not your job. Don't determine who's a weed and who's a wheat. Just go spread the word. Like, that's all. That's your only job.
Well, that's, once again, very practical.
Yeah.
Whether you really believe in the leader or the, establishment or whatever it is, or whether you don't, your job doesn't change as a Christian. It is to point them in the direction of Jesus, ask them what would Jesus do, what's the loving thing to do, whatever. But do that regardless of what you think about them, regardless of what your opinion is, because you're supposed to do that with everybody.
Yeah, and like I really like you bringing it down this level, because it is super easy to go out and vote. It is super easy to get mad over a political issue, get mad over masks or whatever, or get mad at people not wearing masks, whatever. All this is really easy to do. But what's really hard to do is like go volunteer to soup kitchen. Go talk to your pastor and challenge him. Like, to be perfectly honest with you guys, outside of this, I don't get challenged very much by people. People just assume I'm doing all the right things because my title is pastor. Yeah. But I am flawed just as much as anybody else, maybe more so than others, because of that lack of challenging. And so, like, to be really practical for the people listening, like, go, like, ask your pastor how he's doing spiritually. Like, challenge him on something. Like, ask him if he needs accountability. Same thing with anybody in authority in your life. Like, maybe there's maybe you have a local mayor that you can actually reach out to and ask how they're doing, or like support or challenge them, or if you really do believe in Jesus, like, voting for the rights of people is great, but what is way better is going out and trying to feed somebody on the streets, or like do something practical. I don't know. The high level is easy to debate and talk about. And, like, I went right there, so this isn't my fault. No. But, like, to bring it down home, like, to actually ask what would Jesus do and live that out is way harder.
Yeah, and I think that's where maybe the 2 points connect in landing the plane, is, like, once you start living it out, people are going to ask why you're living it out. And then you have that opportunity to kind of do the look back and point thing. And so another practical step is do that. Like, have your life kind of start looking back and see, like, where has God, like, just been a bright shining beam of light to show, like, this is how I've worked. And some places are going to be really obvious. You're like, he gave me a daughter.
Yep.
And then other places, one thing that I just love about, again, C.S. Lewis, is he talks about Jesus' miracles. He talks about the water to wine, and how, like, part of the reason for that miracle is to point us to remind ourselves that every time we see wine, to remember that God is the one who works that miracle. Like, we can scientifically know how it works, but that doesn't change the fact that it does work, and that's a miracle. Like,
it happening is actually incredible.
Exactly. The fact that water becomes wine over a long process is still incredible. Like, there's nothing not incredible about that, just because we know how it works. And so maybe it's like, oh, Roma, came into my life. I have a daughter, and that changed my life, and God just, like, bloom, threw that in there. Or maybe other times it's just like, wow, I have a body, I have a brain, like, these things are happening. We live in a world that's just perfectly distanced from the sun. Like, this isn't a coincidence.
I love having those thoughts.
Yeah.
How are we spinning at the perfect speed? How are we rotating around the sun at the perfect distance?
Yeah, and then so when you have those challenge moments for people, like, this is who I put my hope in, and they're like, why? I think what Esther and Moses and Joseph show us, like, our obligation is to say why, and then whatever they do with that call to authority is not on you. Correct. Like, you are just to be faithful in the doing, and then whether, like Pharaoh, they tell you, no a million times, or whether, like the Persian king here, they're like, yeah, okay, I believe you. That's not really your problem. Like, deliverance will come from right. God either way.
It's just your responsibility to make that effort to them. Yeah. Because God might use them.
Yeah, exactly. So, cool. Esther is sweet. Love it.
I feel like my mouth can't quite keep up.
Yeah. I know, it is. It's hard.
When was the last time you, like, read out loud?
I know.
It's like...
Instead, he went home and spent time with his friends and Zareph and his wife. I don't know where that came from. But he resisted showing his anger right then and there. Instead, he went home and spent time with his friends, Zeresh, his wife. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. All right.
These names are so hard.
Yeah. I can hear the women now talking amongst each other. Why should we listen to our husbands? I can't stop laughing. I wasn't expecting that part.
He was so good. Just picture this like old crippled man.
Yeah. Already getting pretty lit.
No, big fan.
Big fan. The Persians execute their criminals by impaling them on a sharpened pole.
Now we know.
Yep.
Quick to the point. The king was sitting.
The king was seated on his throne.
Right.
It would work.
Let me get some water.
Yeah. Ow now, brown cow.
Unique New York.
The arsonist has oddly shaped feet.
Instead, he went home and spent time with his friends and Zareth, his wife. Zeresh. But he resisted showing his anger right then and there. Instead, he went home and spent time with his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Oh my gosh. Zeresh. His friends and Zeresh. That's like the part that's bothering me.
His friends and Zeresh. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
not very.
I'm going to start 9 again.
Yeah.
Okay. That's one bad dude.
Do you know?
Also, you're...
Haman, did you know?
Haman, did you know? Also, your king got a little like Jamaican.
It got a little more African than it was before.
It was like deeper than you. Yeah.
Whatever.
It's all good. It's all good. One of those eunuchs was Harbona.
Look! Hey!
Oh boy.
You gotta do it, man. Look!
Look, Mickey!
Yeah. Okay.